We are very fortunate and lucky to have Professor van IJzendoorn with us today to close the symposium. Professor van IJzendoorn is a world-renowned expert on social, psychological, and neurobiological determinants of parenting and child development, with special emphasis on various very important seminal works in attachment, emotion regulation, differential susceptibility hypothesis, and child maltreatment. Professor van IJzendoorn published nearly 700 papers, and he's one of the 1% most cited people in psychology and psychiatry. He was awarded numerous prestigious awards and honors. I will mention just a few. He's a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received the highly esteemed Spinoza Prize for his work, lifetime work. He was awarded the Distinguished International Contributions to Child Development Prize by the Society for Research in Child Development. He's the recipient of the Aristotle Prize of the European Psychological Association, and the Bobby Ainsworth Award for the Center of Mental Health Promotion. And these are just a few. So please welcome Professor van IJzendoorn.
So how to start after this introduction? Well, I think it's okay. Okay. Thank you for the invitation to come and present our work, this symposium in memory of Sadeh. I'm going to talk about a line of research on crying that dates back about 35 years ago. It's work done at Leiden University and Erasmus University, Rotterdam, together with a large team, and certainly together with my close colleague, Professor Marian Bakemans-Kranenburg, the picture on the screen. What I would like to discuss are these four topics. Of course, I would like to shed some attachment light on the issue of crying. And I would like to talk about our work on the neurobiology of parental or adult reactions to cry sounds, genetics as well as hormonal influences or associations, with a special emphasis on oxytocin, and last about smiling and laughter and how that affects the human brain. I would like to point out that I'm specializing in the relation between parenting and child development, and that in this talk I'm going to talk about bidirectional influences, the influence of crying of a baby on adults, parents, and the other way around, how parents are shaping the cry curve of young infants. Crying, and that's the attachment part of it, crying, like smiling and babbling, are behaviors that are mediating attachment. That was the observation that has been made already 50, 60 years ago by John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, you might say. Social signal, crying, with the predictable outcome of increased proximity of mother to the child. Mother to be replaced by parent, caregiver, etc. That's what John Bowlby put in a footnote in 1969, and now he would have written it a bit differently. It's increasing proximity and increasing, in the end, inclusive fitness of the offspring in the future. This social signal, by the way, has been noted already way ago, 150 years ago, by Charles Darwin. I think he is the real genius of our discipline, or disciplines, behavioral scientist, expression of emotions, a few pictures of his children too, crying out loud their distress, and he really found this a very fundamental type of behavior, which has been picked up by John Bowlby, making it one of the cornerstones of the development of an attachment relationship. Is it a truly human type of behavior, crying? There's arguing about it in the literature on crying, and crocodile tears, for example, have been observed, at least that's being noted. The internet, for example, might be true because crocodiles have a very complicated eyelid system and it has to be lubricated, so it might be that there's really some kind of basal cry in crocodiles to be observed. Elephants, if any animal is empathic and might have distress, and the elephant is a good candidate, has been observed, at least that's the story that's being told, with tears in the eyes. But the question is that really crying? And there's different types of crying. Basal cry, I already mentioned its function, lubrication. There's also the reflective cry, which is triggered, for example, by hard, cold winds in your eyes or by onions, the smell of onions. And there's this emotional cry, and people argue that this is really uniquely human. Always when scientists argue that this behavior or that behavior is specifically human, I get some kind of doubt, and I don't know. There's so many behaviors being called uniquely human and later on being exposed as being displayed by all kinds of animals, certainly non-human primates. I have observed many, many chimpanzees of a very young age and jerkies in the strange situation, a very stressful situation to measure attachment, and the shrieking after being separated from the human caretaker, the attachment figure, is really cry-sounding like. I didn't see any tears, but it doesn't mean that they don't cry. And this is the picture collated by my colleague Marianne Bakermans-Kranenburg from the internet. And I think two things are remarkable. First of all, how ugly babies can become. It's really awful, I think, in a way. Although, if that would be the first reaction, that would be quite a bad reaction in terms of the responsiveness of the parent to the child. Because in the first round, it should elevate the level of empathy or sympathy at least. So, but what it shows is that most of the pictures, the babies are with closed eyelids and closed eyes. And that's remarkable because eyes are in babies one of the most attractive features. They are larger in relative sense than adult eyes. So there's some kind of direction in which these babies are going that is not really attractive. And that it's a very essential type of behavior, but there's also the big chance that some adults, some parents, cannot stand this type of behavior and will react in a harsh and maltreating manner. I'm sure we are not going to experience this in this room, but I hope to hear more of it. Now, this is a theory that there's a development from infant to adult, a development from tearless infant crying to soundless adult tears. It seems that the relevance of tears are more important as people are growing older. And the question is that true? If you look at these pictures, I myself get almost tears in my eyes if I look at that left side picture, and it's less true for the right side picture. But the same would be true for adult cries, I think, and tears. So what we did in a little study recently was comparing these two pictures, a set of them, and pictures of a baby, of adults with a tear and without a tear, but with a cry face. That's a pity. You come back, hopefully. What we did was comparing the neural responses to either a face of a baby with tears or without tears, and an adult face, cry face, with a tear, without a tear, and see what provoked most intensive neural activation in the brains of the adults that were in the scanners looking at these faces. And what we found was in fact the contrary. The infant tears made much more of an impression on the participants, showing much more neural activation, especially in those centers of the brain, precuneus, inferior frontal gyrus, that are involved in mentalizing. So you see here, upside this screen, you see the infant tear versus the infant no tear phase compared, and the lower side, the lower part is the adult with tears, without tears. And there's also a comparison overall that shows that there's more activation of the neural system towards the child with a tear than to the adult with a tear. Might be that it's quite uncommon that very young children have tears, that they cry out loud in terms of sound, but not so much with flowing tears like in adults. It might also be that it's an extra impetus to be responsive to these cry sounds if they are accompanied by these tears. Now, what about the famous cry curve? This is the cry curve. Ron Barr worked on this cry curve for almost a lifetime, compiling several different studies, longitudinal studies. One of them carried out in Leiden by my PhD student at that time, Franz Hubbard, and myself. This is remarkable in two senses. First of all, there's quite a restricted period of time, a window of, you wouldn't call it opportunity, I think, for parents. It's awful to go through it at around 2 months of age, which is a cry peak. But see the enormous individual differences. Crying 20 to 30 minutes across a day versus 5 to 6 hours. Can you imagine 5 to 6 hours of a crying, persistently crying baby? So it was this epidemiological study done in the Netherlands, published in the Lancet a couple of years ago, showing that already at 6 months after birth, more than 5%, that's a lot, more than 5% of mothers already confessed that they had smothered, had bashed the child, had tried to keep it from crying in a very offensive, very harsh way. So it's one of the triggers of potentially of harsh parenting and child abuse. Whereas on the other hand, it's evolutionary, absolutely crucial for survival. And this shows the shaken baby syndrome figures across months, across age, in weeks in this figure. You see, again, around 2 to 3 months, there's this peak in shaken baby syndrome, maybe related to this cry peak. Of course, this is an association, it's not a causal relation. How is that cross-culturally seen? Ron Barr did a study on the Kung San in Africa, and what he showed basically was that in terms of the cry curve, that's here, in terms of frequency of crying, you see again a cry peak at around 2 to 3 months of age. But if you look at the figures in terms of cry duration, and that's over here, Kung San compared to the Dutch, you see that the Dutch babies are crying twice as much in terms of minutes per hour, and that continues to be the case throughout the first year of life. So it might be that what the Kung San is doing is carrying babies around a lot. That might be a quick response to crying behavior, and therefore not the cry frequency down-regulating, but the cry duration down-regulating. It might be that that would be the trigger, although there's a lot of debate going on about the use of the snuggly in Western societies and how that would affect cry frequency and cry duration. Let me put it straight and in front of my talk. I'm absolutely not a supporter of the idea of attachment parenting. Darcia Narvaez's mentioned in an earlier talk by you, I think. I totally disagree with her approach. So keep that in mind when I'm going forth with my story, because I think she's way too radical in translating potentially happened in way in the past and modern times, and the requirements of child rearing in modern times. But let's see how the evidence looks like. What we did was, and that in fact has a lot to do with a very recent paper and study by Avi Sadeh, and that's this one. I was very impressed reading this. It's a wonderful piece of work, 2016, together with Michael Kahn and Liat Tigotsky, who are here too, present. A wonderful piece of work developing new measures for reactivity to crying, This is one of their findings, and the finding shows that parents of children with sleeping disorders are much more reactive to infant crying videotaped than parents in control families or in adults without children. What they argued, Sadeh and his team, was that if you have a very low tolerance, they call it, for infant crying, then you're going to very promptly intervene in awakenings of the child. Then the child doesn't manage to get into an autonomous kind of coping with crying and fuzzing during the night, and that would create, in the end, infant sleep problems. That was the hypothesis created in this beautiful paper. And it seems to contrast with attachment theory. And is that true? I don't think so, because, and this is a very old study. It's a dear one to me, and I will tell you about it a bit more. This is a study, very intensive study, in which we try to replicate the original Bell and Ainsworth study on the relation between parenting on the one hand and crying on the other hand across the first year of life. These are quarters, so 0 to 3 is the first quarter, and 3 to 6 is the second quarter, and 6 to 9 months is the third quarter. What we did was very carefully observe responsiveness, and in the natural setting, at home, hours and hours of observation. Franz Hubbard, a very intensive PhD on this one. And what we also registered, audio taping it, was crying sounds. And what you see here is an exact confirmation support for Mary Ainsworth's and Bell's conclusion that earlier unresponsiveness of parents create later on more crying. That's very high correlations of 0.53, 0.22 across 2 quarters. What they didn't take into account was that you have to have a look the other way around as well, because bidirectional interactions, bidirectional relationships have been mentioned in the last presentation. What you see is very high correlations too from crying to responsiveness. And if you analyze this according to panel design analysis in statistical sense, you don't find a confirmation of the original Bell and Ainsworth finding. For duration of crying, for frequency, it's even clearer, more clear, that in that case there's even a negative correlation between earlier unresponsiveness, later crying frequency, meaning that more unresponsiveness leads to less crying, which is opposite to the original Ainsworth study. How come? How is this possible? Well, I think the concept of being always prompt might be a problematic concept also within the context of attachment theory, because attachment theory is about signals that are attachment signals, attachment behaviors. And attachment behaviors have been defined as behaviors showing up in situations of stress, distress, illness, etc. And not all fuzzing behavior or slight crying is caused by that type of contact. So it's not always a call for proximity and protection. So you have to take into account the differential meaning of crying and the differential responsiveness of parents to different types of crying. That's, I think, essential, the conclusion of our longitudinal study. It was a study that's dear to me because it was almost never cited. At least it was almost never cited in attachment theoretical papers. It has been cited and used a lot by Ron Barr and others, specializing, being experts in crying, but not in the attachment field. And that's when I became aware of the importance of replication, and we're talking here about the beginning of the 90s of the past century, the importance of replication and the importance of meta-analysis, and that's the trajectory that I took after this adventure, which was, for a young scientist at that point in time, rather frustrating, I might tell you. And not in the least for my PhD student, by the way. Anyway, so that's the story of the normal crying curve and the huge individual differences, and that they might be related to parenting, but maybe a little bit different from what we I used to think in attachment theory, or used to think. The Snuggly, I still am a great supporter of the Snuggly. I used it myself when my son was crying a lot in the first 1.5 years, maybe 2 years, so really crying a lot. But empirically, there is some lack of evidence still, and we are in the process of setting up a real controlled, randomized controlled trial, independent of the industry, etc., to see whether the Snuggly really helps or not, to lower the cry curve in around a 2-3 month period, but also in general to make it more easygoing for the parents. I think Sadeh was right in this respect, that extreme responsiveness might be increasing cry behavior, and thus might also increase sleeping problems. Now, attachment and the neural reactivity to crying, the perspective the other way around, the crying that has an influence on adult listeners. What we do is, using this paradigm, an imaging paradigm, which is making use of this cry sound of a 2 days old infant. We need the baby that just left the room. I don't have sound. Maybe, well, if it's not possible, it's so possible. No. So, yeah, you just have to come close to the machine, and the crying, the machine is going to cry. So, this is maybe irresistible. I'm not going to have you listen to the 700 hertz artificially elevated level of pitch by the computer. It's really shrieking, and 900 hertz is a kind of really indicating sickness or illness in the child. What we do is having adults listening, parents, adults listening to these cry sounds in the scanner and see how they respond to these sounds related to what we know about these adults in terms of their attachment histories. So the adult attachment interview, this study has been conducted, and this is the control group, 21 monozygotic twins, 21 dizygotic twins. And what we did was conducting this adult attachment interview. It's the classic golden standard for cognitive representation of past childhood experiences with parents. It's semi-structured, about an hour it takes. It asks for, and that's the most important part, asks for general descriptors. How did you feel about your parents? How did your parents feel about you? Lovingly or rejecting or whatever. And then asking for concrete evidence from attachment-related experiences. Those are the most important indicators for what is central to the rating scale in this adult attachment interview, coherence. It's the coherence across the text, independent of what the subject or participant meant. It's narrative coherence. It's the coherence between concrete evidence, concrete illustrations, and generalizations about the relationship with the parents. So it's not dependent on autobiographical memory. We did psychometric studies showing that autobiographical memory in general is not related to the outcome of this interview. Mary Main and Erik Hesse were instrumental to this. This is an example. This is an example of a, what you might call a secure transcript. And the objective was, this is, my father was not a very physical person. That's something I realized later on, that I might have missed that. Maybe it's a bit strongly put, but because I remember some instances that we cuddled together in front of the TV, but my father did not give a lot of physical affection. This is reflective, empathic, balanced, and there's a lot of evidence for this nuanced general descriptor. It's open, it's coherent. So this is typical fragment from a secure, what we call a secure autonomous transcript interview. This is a totally different one. It's a positive adjective. My mother was very lovingly. that was a general thing. When asked for a concrete illustration, that was a general thing. I can't think of no example. You just know that she loved you. Wow, that's difficult. I could always get what I wanted. So it's going from love as an immaterial to love as a material thing. It's showing lack of recall. Again, it's restricted only to attachment, not to the color of your first bike, for example. A study done in Holland, you can imagine. It's idealization, which is insecure dismissive, as we call such a transcript. This is another insecure type of transcript, just briefly. Mother is called dissatisfied. She was never satisfied with her looks, always complaining about her weight and this and that, about the washing and the cleaning, always self-victimizing, always being pathetic, you know, the type, you know. You go wash your own stuff. Okay, I'm not your slave. So this is angry. This is really an intrusion. This is really a failure to mark quotations. This is really going back into the past and be still angry about what your mother did to you. That's the preoccupied insecurity displayed in this interview. And this is unresolved loss of trauma around a series of questions about loss of beloved figures, parents, other persons. He was so lonely. It was 16 years ago that the father had died. So he was so lonely, and then he died, and it was an open casket, you know, flowers, a shiny watch, this picture on the wall, you know. So he just knows I'm still there for him. So the reversing and disbelief in the death of this father, continuing presence, an indication of unresolved loss of trauma. Now, if you have listening these different types of these different scoring individuals in the scanner to cry sounds, you get different results. The control sound looks like or listens to like this. It's acoustically exactly the same. You hear even the prosodic part of it, the cry sound, but it's the same sound, only randomly in a random order. And it's the contrast between the real cry sound and this sound that makes for neural activation differences. And this is what we saw, especially in the amygdala, and difference in activation between the insecure attached individuals responding to non-kin, this was not their own offspring, not their own child, infant crying, versus those who were securely attached. And amygdala has been associated in the past in many different studies, at least with elevated levels of arousal that might turn into aversion, anxiety even, when the stimulus is of a negative kind, or labeled as a negative stimulus. This is a fundamental difference between insecure and secure, securely attached adults. And it doesn't matter what type of insecurity, all the different types of insecurity are responding in elevated manner, the brain, to these cry sounds. And it's not only the brain that is responding differently, it's also to be seen in irritated feelings of the respondents, which are tending to be higher in the insecures, listening to the same cry sounds. And it's also to be seen in this hand grip paradigm. Hand grip paradigm works as follows. You have to push as strong as you can to monitor. You can see what you're doing. Then you have to go for half strength. And you see it on the monitor, and soon after 4 or 5 trials you can do that. Go from full strength to half strength. Then you've got a trick. Monitor is put away. You listen to cry sounds. And the question is, are you able to go from full to half strength, or are you do more than half strength? And what you see here is the outcome of this study is that the insecurely attached individuals are going overboard in a way, are exerting more power than half strength power when they listen to cry sounds. So that's a behavioral concomitant of the neural activation. So what did we learn up until this point? That insecure representations are related to more amygdala reactivity to crying, and that insecure representations are also related to stronger hand grip and more irritated feelings. What about genetics? We did several studies on twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins. One of the studies was about the heritability of responding to cry sounds. comparing monozygotic and dizygotic twins and how they responded to cryosans in terms of the heart rate reactivity. And we also did several experimental studies with oxytocin as intranasally administered. What we found was for genetics, the behavior genetic part was, you have to look at the yellow lines here, that about 40 to 50% of the variance in heart rate reactivity to cry sounds can be explained by genetic similarities between the twins. And the rest is unique environment, so no shared environments involved here. And the genes that are responsible for the baseline heart rate are also responsible for this reactivity. That's what this bivariate model behavior genetics is telling. Now that pushed us in the direction of looking for specific genes that might be involved in differential reactions to cry sounds. Because behavior genetics doesn't tell you anything about what genes are involved in, are explaining different types of reactivity. And we looked for the usual suspect oxytocin receptor gene, because that's implicated in the production the reception of oxytocin levels in the body and in the brain, neurotransmitter. And what we found was that if the individuals listening to cry sounds were not depressed, not symptoms of depression, indeed the GG carriers responded with higher heart rates to the cry sounds. So this polymorphism of oxytocin receptor gene is related, it seems, to reactions, to responses to cry sounds, but only when there is not an elevated level of depression visible. This was a rather small study, so we replicated that in the second study, and what we found was about the same type of pattern, that it's the GG carriers are very responsive, but only when they are not showing any depressive symptoms. So that brought us into the area of manipulating the oxytocin levels, not by looking at structural DNA, but by intranasally administering oxytocin sniffs. Oxytocin has been used for ages already, facilitating delivery, breastfeeding, but it's also used now quite often in social psychology experiments on social interactions, seems to elevate trust and maybe also sensitive parenting. At least it was in one of the studies that we found this. So how would oxytocin sniffs, how would that impact the responses to cry sounds? This is the oxytocin molecule. It's quite large, and so the blood-brain barrier is not really being transmitted by this huge molecule. So you have to find other ways to administer or elevate the level of oxytocin, and intranasal administration seems to be the way to do it. And this is how you can find oxytocin on the internet in the form of liquid trust. It's for sale for people who would like to sell second-hand cars or would get a partner or get better along with their colleagues. Don't buy liquid trust, because I don't know whether there's any oxytocin available in that type of. We are getting our oxytocin sniffs by the pharmacy of the University Medical Center. But it's widely advertised as the love hormone, and it's called liquid trust. And it's used in clinical practice already, way before we have sufficient evidence. This is a picture from a practice. This is a clinical treatment of a boy of 7 years, treated for autism, sniffs every day to elevate the level of social recognition, social ability. But we don't know what the side effects are for young children. We only did, at this point, till this point in time, oxytocin research in adults, not in children. And we don't know whether it really affects, in randomized controlled trials, the autistic symptomatology of children with this disorder. Why do oxytocin research? I think it's very important to understand what the cascade is from input, crying for example, to output, a certain kind of responsiveness. In between there are neural reactivities, there's hormones involved, and so we have to study to know exactly who is most vulnerable to going overboard, to show harsh parenting when children are crying, who is not at risk for that type of behavior that is a precursor of potential child maltreatment. All kinds of research done on how sniffs through the intranasal cavities reaching the brain, still debatable. I think there's quite some evidence now from animal research and human research that it does reach critical brain areas, but there's still discussion around it. And this is a study that I would like to show you. Oxytocin reduces amygdala activation to infant crying. Not in the placebo, you see the elevated placebo group, but it's lowered, down-regulated this amygdala reactivity in the oxytocin condition. And it's increased reactivity in the insula and in the inferior frontal gyrus, those centers that are important for empathic or sympathetic concern. And so I think this is the foundation potentially in the brain in terms of neural activation of less anxiety, more empathy, better responses to infant crying. Would it have to be used by all parents? We don't know. I think it would be not adequate to prescribe it as a mother's little helper to everyone, because we don't know exactly whether it works for everyone and whether there are not side effects, even for adults. And that's still an unknown. What we do know is that for insecure adults, oxytocin intranasal administered is lowering this hyperactivity in the amygdala, which is, I think, an important piece of the puzzle to explain how it comes that insecurity leads to differential reactivity to infant crying. And again, it doesn't matter whether these are dismissing, preoccupied, or unresolved adults. They all profit, you might say, from these oxytocin sniffs to lower their neuroreactivity to infant crying. And it's also true for this hand grip paradigm, that the hand grip force is lowered, is less strain in the oxytocin condition. And how come? What is oxytocin doing that this is going to happen? And one of the potential explanations is, especially in insecurely attached individuals who have bad experience in their past as a child, that oxytocin might enable them to more accurately differentiate between certain crying that requires immediate response and those that are not requiring that immediate responses. And that's shown, I think, or at least illustrated in this little piece of research. We compared here two types of labeling of the same acoustic signal. It's crying, the same sound, but in a certain set of trials it's being labeled as crying from an ill child, and in another set of trials it's labeled as coming from a child that's bored. So what does it make a difference in terms of neural activation? Again, a comparison between cry labeled sick or bored versus these scrambled sounds. What you can see here is that in the IFG and left insula, there is this more sharp differentiation in the oxytocin condition of the crying sounds coming from the bored, lowered activation versus the sick child that requires a response, an immediate response, elevated levels of IFG and insula activation. And I think this is an illustration of the potential great role of mind over brain, mind over matter, of the power of different representations creating different neural processing of the same physical stimuli. And in fact, that's, I think, also one of the beautiful findings of Sadeh and his team in this Journal of Sleep Research paper. Here is the outcome of a certain assessment of how people consider in vignettes described crying during the night of infants. And you and see a much more intensive attribution of distress to vignettes in parents of sleep-disordered children, when they have these vignettes to evaluate versus controls or control parents without children with sleep disorders. So it seems that the meaning of the same cry sounds for different people, people with different types of backgrounds, create different responsiveness and might create or might be triggering sleep problems during the night. So this is, I think, wrapping up what I just told, quickly to the last part, the more optimistic part maybe. And that's the part what concerns smiling and laughter. Quite important to see how laughter influences the parental brain. It's a very important attachment behavior. It strengthens the bond. At least that's the theory. And is that also true? I think this is a beautiful picture of Sadeh. I think he was very humorous. He appreciated humor a lot. It's written in the Talmud ages ago that you can start, but maybe you can also finish a talk having people laughing, and that's what I'm going to do. At least that's my prediction that's going to happen. So it's wonderful to see. I mean, you are the most expressive audience that I ever had, because I did this more often. But maybe it's Israeli kind to respond to this type of sounds. But no audience remains just silent, and always there's a smile or even a laughter. So it's very contagious. And that's already being noted by, of course, the genius Charles Darwin. And he makes even very ugly faces, if I may say so, on the right side. In fact, attractive because of the smiling outlook here. Beautiful example of a few smiling people. And these are, you know, you are going to smile if you see this type of, and it's so rewarding. Not for all parents, but for most parents, this is one of the most rewarding signals that a child could emit. Now, and it's proximity, creating proximity, adaptive, and a very rewarding experience. Is that to be seen in the scanner? What we did was having individuals listen to these laughter sounds and to control sounds and compare. What we saw was that in the oxytocin condition, again, there was reduced amygdala activation. So any feeling of aversion or arousal was lowered by this oxytocin condition, listening to laughter. And what was more importantly maybe is that there was an increased connectivity between these amygdala activations and the activation in reward regions like the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. So that, I think, makes, at least for part of an illustration or explanation even, of how rewarding this is also under the skin of people or in the brains of people listening to laughter sounds. So it might be one of the missing pieces that we should more carefully look at, and how it might come in some cases of people who are insecure, having bad experiences, lower levels potentially of oxytocin, that are less appreciative of laughter sounds of children. I want to end with this yellow statement that I think, although there's a lot of debate around this behavioral management of sleep problems in attachment literature and attachment circles, that I think he was absolutely right that just prompt responding to every cry sound during the night is not really helpful to make the child, the baby, coping with his own or her own fuzzing and crying during the first year of life. So there should be something of differential responsiveness being promoted in parents. How to promote it, that might be still a puzzle to find out, But I think Sadeh was absolutely a target. The just prompt responses to infant crying that has been advertised in the attachment parenting literature was wrongly based on attachment theory. I think he was totally a target. Thank you so much for your...
Question?
So I understand that infant's crying has a special importance, but do you think that the pattern of individual differences in response to infant's crying is essentially different than individual differences in response to any kind of another person's stress?
Of another person's distress or of another child's distress. No, it's... so let's stick to children. I think crying is just one example, but a very, I think, a very urgent example, a very forceful example of attachment behavior. And so it should be responded to one way or the other after being interpreted and processed. But in many ways it's not different from babbling or from other distress signals, like only having a cry phase or a sad phase. So crying is not a necessary condition for parental responsiveness, but I think it's one of the major forces in the first, let's say, 6 months, 7 months. There are all kinds of other ways to have an attachment relationship emerging in the first months and years of life. One of them being sensitive to signals that the child would like to play, or is reassured when it's feeling stressed, but it's prevented from crying. I think it's very important to note that really sensitive parents are able to foresee the future in a way, to plan, to see what would be really bothering this child, and then try to prevent it from happening if they know that a child would not be able to cope with it, her or himself. So it's anticipation, it's thinking about the future, it's planning. A lot of parenting, I think, in the first few years is thinking, is rational, is planning. It's of course it's an emotional. You need emotions to make the step from feelings to actual behavior, to do something about things, but you have to really frame, to have a narrative about what's happening. What is this child telling me, this baby that doesn't have any words? You should speak for the baby. That's our video feedback intervention, tries to make parents speak for the baby that is still non-verbal, to know or to have a hunch of what he or she is experiencing, and then respond to that. That's, I think, essential. That's the core of the parent's part of the attachment relationship. Crying is one example. So I think because it's so inborn in our species to respond to cry sounds rather spontaneously, that it doesn't matter so much whether you hear your own, if that's your question also, your own child crying or another child's is crying. Many of our studies have been done with adults listening to cry sounds, not their own child, because it's technically rather difficult to have controlled stimuli taken from your own child, because it's different in age, different in mood, etc., etc. So use a lot of not kin cry sounds and very strong neural and behavioral reactions to those sounds. But that does make sense, because we are born, I think, we are a species that is responsive to intuitive parenting, not in the attachment parenting way or conceptualization, but in the way of earlier work by Daniel Stern and others that show that you are easily from very first beginning intertwined in a kind of a dance responsive to your child's signal. Synchronous interactions are, I think, belonging to our inborn makeup. So that's what responses to cry sounds are built upon, I think. That would be my hunch. Is that going into... Okay.
Yes, not fully satisfied. So maybe can I ask a continuation question? You very elegantly, in your MRI studies, use the contrast you show is between cry and then synthesized sound that goes along with the cry. But I will follow on your question. Could it be that what you are seeing is are individual differences in reactivity to negative or aversive sounds? Because the sound you use as contrast was not so aversive, but if the sound was very aversive but mechanical, or so perhaps it's just a personal sensitivity to aversive sounds or sounds in general, and not because the narrative of attachment is very powerful, so we go with it very
Right, good.
But in reality, it could be a sensory sensitivity that is not at all related to attachment or only
Maybe this was your question? Or? No, okay.
it has no connection to this question.
No, I think that's absolutely a possibility. I would bet we should do a study and have other sounds listened to and see whether there's as intense a reaction in the neural sense and in sense of hand grip, for example, as we saw in response to crying sounds. Because there is something like sensitivity to sound. Sensory sensitivity is in fact a marker of differentiability. It's another line of research that I'm very attached to. So I'm aware of this possibility. I think, first of all, it's very difficult to compare different, even more conditions than we are doing now with our relatively small samples. There's a lot of critique on fMRI studies because they are underpowered. Ioannidis is complaining about all the time, false positives, etc. So the more conditions, the lower the power. But even if some kind of sound, artificial sound, not human sound even, would trigger similar type of reactivity, would that mean that this would be negated, this type of findings? I don't think so, because the one might be built upon the other, and it would not explain anything about why insecure attached individuals are differently responding as a group, not as individuals. And I never saw any study that correlates in a one-to-one correspondence sensory sensitivity and insecure attachment. So I think it's well, this is circumstantial reasoning. I totally agree. But even if you would not find much difference in terms of individual difference, listening to those different sounds, I would still feel that it's important to have real cry sounds, because that's what it's all about in the end, isn't it? We try in the end to create interventions, preventive interventions, to have different labels. And it's interesting, very interesting, basic scientific question that you asked. But I don't think it takes away from the message that I brought, that it's important to change the perception of the same cry sounds in people with insecure backgrounds.
I have a very concrete question. So I'm really naive, honestly. I have no idea you get liquid oxytocin and a sniff. No idea.
Oh, you did not? Okay.
So what's the half-life on it? How long is it something that lasts for 5 minutes, or is this like once a day?
Well, half-life, just in open air, is about half a minute, I think. So,
What about, and how about with looking at brain activity?
yeah, that's the story that I skipped because I thought I wouldn't keep in time. First of all, we did a study applying intranasal oxytocin measuring it several different time points, after an hour, after 3 hours, after 4 hours, 7 hours. Even after 7 hours, you find 5 times to 10 times elevated levels of oxytocin in the saliva. Now, people could argue, and I think that's rather implausible, that is dripping back into the cavity of the mouth of intranasally applied oxytocin. But after 7 hours, after having drank water and all that, I think that's far-fetched, but it might be true. What I think is happening, and Ruth Feldman is working a lot in Israel with oxytocin, endogenous oxytocin levels mostly. What she argues, and I think she has some evidence for that, is that it's triggering a kind of a cascade, a kind of a forward feedback mechanism, forward system, that if you just go over a certain limit of oxytocin levels in certain areas of the brain, that then it's self-perpetuating. And that's what happens in the natural setting, breastfeeding. Her studies on interactions between parents and babies, that there's a perpetuation of this elevated levels of oxytocin because of breastfeeding or these smooth interactions with the baby. So that would be my hunch, that would work in human beings. What we saw in terms of resting state, which is without any paradigm, so no problem with placebo and all that, resting state, oxytocin effects are quite visible. We did a study showing that neuroactivation without any paradigm, just resting state, is changing this resting state activation compared to the placebo condition. So I don't know. I recently got a paper to review with Holstein steers sniffing oxytocin, and they started to ruminate a lot. So I thought, my goodness, so this is a bad effect of oxytocin. Now I was thinking further and further. I'm having a background in agriculture, and yes, rumination is when cows are relaxed and are going to ruminate because they have these difficult stomachs. So even in Holstein steers, it has been documented that sniffers of oxytocin. I don't know. Still, people, you can read in the literature very many contrasting arguments and reasoning, and it still has to be shown exactly how it goes through the epithelium or through indirect through the blood. Anyway, some way or the other, it's still unknown, really, in human beings. But it has been shown to exist in rats and mice, in rhesus monkeys and other species.
Ron, go ahead. Actually, go ahead. Yeah.
First of all, great talk. Given some evidence of oxytocin being not simply trust, but in-group, out-group learning, I was interested in your comment about that it didn't matter if it's your child or another child. I'm wondering if you've really explored that, and whether it's more about learning the investment of attachment in individually, and then that interacting with the insecurely attached. Have you explored some of those complexities?
In-group, out-group is an important issue in social psychology. For example, oxytocin research taking place in that. De Dreux did a paper it was in Science, I think, showing at least a tendency that there's oxytocin effect, which is going to be more in the aggressive direction, and for the in-group it's more cozy and warm. And in fact, that's related to animal research too, because if you have animals with high levels of oxytocin, they are very protective of their offspring, but very aggressive to anyone or any animal who would like to commit infanticide. So I think basically oxytocin does, it's not a love hormone, of course not. What it basically does is sharpening the reception of stimuli, sounds or pictures or whatever. Also in-group, out-group differentiation might be sharpened by oxytocin. But I think our stimuli in terms of crying don't trigger that type of in-group, out-group feeling. Therefore, I think you have more, more potent stimuli that make that differentiation between in-group and out-group visible. So, one of my hypotheses about insecurity is we saw that donating, pro-social behavior, is also influenced by oxytocin SNPs. But in some people more than in other people, what we speculated was that insecure individuals reacting not so altruistic to oxytocin when they have to donate money costly to a stranger, that it might mean that their out-group is quite large. And the in-group is quite small, it's only a few people. And so they define that person who needs the donation, they define it as the out-group. Whereas people with a secure background maybe are a little more open to consider other individuals, even though they are strangers, be part of humankind and in-group. I don't know, it's speculative, very speculative. Yeah.
That's a good question for dinner.
I'm not going to give you any classification of Donald Trump in terms of attachment. Now, there is research done on attachment and political, but it's more attachment style. So it's a little bit of a different tradition of doing attachment research in the social psychology area. And then it's the style of attachment, more contemporary, how you relate to your partner, your peers, not cognitively processing what happened in the past. So, yeah, Schaefer, Mikko Linse, very famous for his research, and I think he did also political attitudes. It's one of his. No, not that I know of. No. Okay.
You can leave it on. I'll conclude very quickly.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to thank you all for coming here, honoring Avi's life, and I want to thank the guests for marvelous talks and an excellent scientific day. I'm sure that Avi would have loved to attend and be part of this, and not only being among friends, but also the content, which he valued so much. I was listed for half an hour, but no worries, I will talk for 30 more seconds. I'm very touched by the friendship that you showed, and also some of you are very close to Avi, family, students, and colleagues. And for us, it's still very hard to process what happened, and but I'm happy with this day, and I think it does right by Avi's way. So thank you all, and I hope to see all of you sometime soon.